Everett Kane's weathered boots dragged across the dusty square of Prosperity Junction, each step heavier than the last. His calloused fingers clutched the last 50 cents he owned in the world, the coins warm against his palm in the midday heat. The territorial auction had drawn every rancher and businessman worth their salt, but none had shown interest in the final lot, the dilapidated Henderson barn sitting crooked on the edge of town. Everett felt the weight of eyes upon him, some curious, most mocking, as he raised his hand to bid. Sterling Maddox's laugh cut through the murmurs of the crowd, his silver pocket watch gleaming as bright as his reputation. The territory's wealthiest rancher stood surrounded by his usual circle of influence: bankers, politicians, and fellow landowners who'd built their fortunes on Sterling's good graces and water rights. 50 cents for that pile of kindling? Sterling's voice carried across the square, intended for all to hear. The drought's finally dried up your good sense, Kane. Everett kept his gaze fixed on the auctioneer, ignoring the ripple of laughter. 3 years since Clara had left, taking their savings and leaving him with Lily to raise alone, and still these men treated him like an outsider. But they hadn't seen what he had during his inspection of the property last week. The strange markings on the back wall that matched his grandfather's old surveyor symbols, patterns that spoke of something valuable hidden from untrained eyes. Going once for 50 cents. Going twice. The auctioneer's voice cracked with disbelief. Sold to Everett Kane. The crowd dispersed quickly, interest evaporating now that the auction had concluded. Only Sterling lingered, his gaze calculating, as Everett accepted the rusted key and property deed. The rancher's hand came down heavy on Everett's shoulder, fingers pressing into the worn fabric of his jacket. Never took you for a fool, Kane. Then again, a man with your circumstances can't be too particular, I suppose. Sterling's voice dropped lower, meant for Everett alone. If you find yourself wanting to unload your new acquisition, I might take it off your hands. $50, triple your investment. Everett stepped away from Sterling's grip, tucking the deed into his jacket pocket. Something in Sterling's offer raised the hairs on his neck. The man who controlled more land and water than anyone in 3 territories wouldn't waste words on a worthless barn. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Maddox, but I've got plans for it. Sterling's smile never reached his eyes. We all need our dreams, Kane, even impossible ones. The sun hung low in the western sky as Everett made his way back to the cabin on the outskirts of town. The small structure had once seemed temporary, a place to land after Clara left. But 2 years had passed and he'd made no progress toward anything better. The thought of Lily growing up in such modest circumstances weighed on him daily. She was waiting on the porch steps, dark braids bouncing as she jumped up at the sight of him. Her face, so like her mother's, lit with curiosity. The hope in her eyes made his heart ache. Did you get it, Pa? Did you win the barn? He produced the key from his pocket, holding it up so it caught the last rays of sunlight. 50 cents for a new beginning. That's a bargain if I ever saw one. Lily took the key, turning it over in her small hands with reverence that only a 10-year-old could muster for such an ordinary object. Can we see it now? Please? Everett glanced at the setting sun, measuring the remaining daylight. The truth was, he couldn't wait another moment himself. His grandfather's journal sat heavy in his saddlebag, the pages marked with symbols that matched those he'd glimpsed on the barn wall. Whatever secret the Henderson place held, it had been important enough for someone to leave markers only a trained surveyor would recognize. The barn stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its weathered boards hanging at odd angles like broken teeth in an old man's smile. From the outside, it appeared ready to collapse under its own weight. Perfect camouflage, Everett realized, designed to discourage interest from those who didn't know better. Lily hung back, suddenly uncertain. It looks scary, Pa, like it might fall down. He squeezed her shoulder gently. Sometimes things aren't what they seem, Lily girl. Remember what Grandpa used to say? The best treasures hide in plain sight because most folks don't bother looking twice. The key turned with surprising ease in the rusted padlock. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, the first indication that appearances were deceiving. Everett's eyes took a moment to adjust to the dimness inside, but what emerged from the shadows defied every expectation. While the exterior suggested decades of neglect, the interior revealed deliberate care. The floorboards, though dusty, were solid oak that showed signs of regular maintenance. Support beams stood straight and true, reinforced with newer lumber in strategic places. The walls, which appeared paper-thin and rotting from outside, were actually double-constructed, with a solid inner shell hidden behind the deliberately weathered exterior. Lily stepped inside, her voice hushed with wonder. "It's not broken at all." Everett ran his hand along one of the support beams, feeling the quality of the craftsmanship. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make this place look abandoned from the outside. The question is, why? His eyes were drawn to the back wall where he'd first noticed the markings. In the fading light, they were barely visible, a series of notches and symbols carved into the wood that would appear random to most observers. But to a man raised by a territorial surveyor, they formed a pattern as clear as any map. Henderson's mark was here, along with symbols indicating water. Not just any water, but a source of significant volume and quality. The kind that could transform worthless land into the most valuable property in the territory. Everett's pulse quickened as he traced the carvings with his finger, following the directions they indicated. The sound of approaching horses pulled his attention back to the present. Through the gaps in the weathered boards, he spotted Sterling Maddox and his foreman, James Cooper, riding toward the barn. Sterling's interest in the property now made perfect sense. He must have suspected something about the barn, but lacked the knowledge to interpret the markings. "Lily, stay by the door. If I tell you to run, you head straight for Thomas Whitman's store. You remember the way?" She nodded, eyes wide, as she picked up on her father's tension. The horses stopped outside, and boots crunched on the hard-packed earth. Sterling's voice carried through the gaps in the walls. "Doesn't look like much, does it, Cooper? Amazing at what some men will waste their last coins on." James Cooper's response came lower, respectful but uncertain. "If you say so, Mr. Maddox, though I recall you showing interest in this place yourself last year." Sterling's laugh held no humor. "The Henderson land has certain historical curiosities. Nothing of real value, I assure you." The barn door creaked open, and Sterling's imposing figure filled the doorway, his expensive coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the humble surroundings. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Everett and Lily inside, as though he hadn't expected them to take possession so quickly. "Mr. Kane, giving your daughter the grand tour of your investment, I see." Everett shifted subtly, placing himself between Sterling and the carved wall. "Just getting acquainted with my property, Mr. Maddox." Sterling stepped inside, followed by Cooper, a former soldier whose reputation for loyalty to his employer was matched only by his efficiency. Unlike his boss, Cooper gave Everett a respectful nod, one working man to another. The gesture wasn't lost on Sterling, whose eyes hardened momentarily. "Your property." Sterling tested the words like a man sampling something bitter. 50 cents for a structure that stood empty for 3 years. "I'm curious, Kane. What exactly do you plan to do with it?" Everett met his gaze steadily. "The same thing any man does with his own property. Make something of it." Cooper moved around the space, his trained eye noting the same discrepancies Everett had observed between the exterior appearance and interior condition. His hand brushed against one of the reinforced beams, and something like respect flickered across his face. "This is solid craftsmanship, Mr. Maddox." Henderson knew what he was doing. Sterling dismissed the observation with a wave. Henderson was a stubborn fool who didn't know when to accept a generous offer. Now his widow's left with nothing but memories. And Mr. Kane here has inherited a project. He turned his attention back to Everett, his voice shifting to the smooth tone of a businessman about to propose a deal. "I've been thinking, Kane, 50 cents is hardly a fair price, even for this. Let me make you a more equitable offer, $5. That's 10 times your investment, and you can put it towards something more appropriate for your situation." The deliberate pause made Sterling's meaning clear. $5 wouldn't change Everett's fortunes, but it would remove him from property that Sterling wanted for reasons he wasn't stating. The fact that the wealthiest man in the territory was standing in this supposedly worthless barn, making personal offers, confirmed Everett's suspicions. The surveyor's marks weren't just historical curiosities. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Maddox, but I'm not interested in selling." Something dangerous flashed in Sterling's eyes before he masked it with a practiced smile. "We all make decisions based on the information available to us, Kane. Sometimes, with more information, we might choose differently. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Sterling tipped his hat to Lily, whose small hand had found its way into her father's grasp. Miss Kane, I hope your father's investment brings you both all the happiness you deserve. As Sterling and Cooper departed, Everett felt the weight of what he'd just done. He'd refused the territory's most powerful man, a man who controlled the water rights that determined who prospered and who failed in this drought-prone region. Whatever secret the Henderson barn held, Sterling Maddox wanted it badly enough to make personal visits and thinly veiled threats. Lily's voice broke the silence. He doesn't like us having the barn, does he, Pa? Everett squeezed her hand, his mind already calculating their next steps. It's not about liking or not liking, Lily girl. It's about value. Mr. Maddox sees something valuable here that he thinks we don't recognize. But we do recognize it, don't we, Pa? He looked down at his daughter's perceptive face, wondering how much to share. Some of it, but I think there's more to discover. The sun had set by the time they secured the barn and headed back to their cabin. Everett's mind raced with possibilities as he tucked Lily into bed with promises of returning to their new property tomorrow. Once she was asleep, he pulled out his grandfather's journal and a lantern, spreading the worn pages across the kitchen table. The journal contained decades of surveying notes, including maps of water sources throughout the territory, many of which had later become Sterling Maddox's property. His grandfather had possessed an almost supernatural ability to locate underground water, a skill he'd tried to pass to Everett before his death 2 years ago. Hours passed as Everett compared the barn's markings to similar notations in the journal. Near midnight, his finger stopped on an entry from 30 years earlier, when his grandfather had surveyed the Henderson property during a devastating drought. The description matched precisely what he'd seen carved on the barn wall, indicators of an artesian well with significant pressure and volume, likely containing mineral-rich water ideal for crops. Such a discovery would be valuable in any circumstance, but in a territory where Sterling Maddox controlled nearly every significant water source, it was priceless. An artesian well that produced enough volume could transform not just a single property, but potentially the surrounding land as well. If Henderson had discovered such a well, why hide it rather than develop it? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Few visitors came at this hour, and fewer still with good intentions. Everett tucked the journal away and approached the door cautiously, relaxing only when he heard a familiar voice. Everett, it's Violet McCall. I need to speak with you. Violet stood on his porch, her usual composed demeanor replaced by evident concern. As the town's school teacher, she'd always shown kindness to Lily, especially after Clara left. Her presence at this hour, however, suggested something beyond normal neighborly concern. I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but I thought you should know. Sterling Maddox came by my father's ranch this evening. He was asking questions about your family, about your grandfather in particular. Everett ushered her inside, noting the tension in her movements. Why would Sterling care about my grandfather? He's been gone 2 years now. Violet tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, her eyes troubled. That's what seemed odd. He specifically wanted to know if your grandfather had ever surveyed the Henderson property, if he'd left any maps or journals. When my father said he didn't know, Sterling suggested it might be beneficial to our water allocation if we remembered anything helpful. The implication wasn't subtle. Cooperation would be rewarded, refusal punished. In a drought year, Sterling's control of water rights gave him leverage over every rancher in the territory. There's something else. Violet hesitated, lowering her voice though no one else was present. Before she left town, Widow Henderson gave me something to hold. She said to pass it to whoever eventually bought their property, but only if they seemed to be looking in the right places. I didn't understand what she meant until I heard you'd purchased the barn today. From her pocket, she withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with wax that bore the impression of a surveyor's compass. For someone who found more than just an old barn, were her exact words. Everett accepted the envelope, the paper thick and substantial against his fingers. The wax seal matched the mark he'd seen on the barn wall, Henderson's personal surveyor mark. Did she say anything else? Violet's expression darkened. Only that her husband didn't leave willingly. There was an accident at the barn that convinced them it was time to go. 3 weeks later, they packed up in the middle of the night and left the territory. Most folks assumed they couldn't make the payments on their land, but But the Henderson place was one of the few properties in the territory with no mortgage, Everett finished, remembering details from his grandfather's conversations. They owned it outright, had for 3 generations. Exactly. They abandoned a family legacy with no explanation, and now Sterling Maddox is suddenly interested in your family connection to theirs. After Violet departed with promises to keep her ears open for any other developments, Everett broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was a hand-drawn map with surveyor's marks indicating underground water flows and a letter dated 3 years earlier. To whoever finds our legacy, if you're reading this, you've purchased our property and recognized the markings for what they are. My husband's grandfather discovered what flows beneath our land during the Great Drought of 1847, when entire settlements were abandoned for lack of water. What he found wasn't just water, but a blessing, an artesian well with mineral properties that make crops grow with twice the yield of normal irrigation. He and Jeremiah Kane, who surveyed this territory in those early days, made a pact. They would hide the well until the territory was developed enough to benefit all, not just the fortunate few who owned the land above it. They feared that revealing such a treasure too soon would lead to the same greed and violence that had followed gold discoveries elsewhere. For 3 generations, our families have protected this secret, maintaining the barn as both camouflage and marker. The well itself remains sealed but intact, accessible to someone who understands the symbols and mechanics our grandfathers created. Recent events have forced us to leave, but we could not destroy what God has provided. What flows beneath is worth more than gold, but only to those who share rather than hoard. If you found our letter, you have the knowledge of the Kane family or the curiosity our ancestors hoped would eventually serve the greater good. Be careful. There are those who suspect what we've hidden, though they lack the skills to find it. The drought will come again, as it always does, and when it does, this well could save more than one family's fortune. It could save the entire territory. Martha Henderson Everett read the letter twice, his mind connecting pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered throughout his life. His grandfather's reluctance to sell his surveying journals, even when money was tight. The strange lessons in water-finding techniques that seemed impractical for a boy unlikely to follow a surveyor's path. The stories about the Henderson family that always seemed to contain hidden meanings. It hadn't been random knowledge, it had been preparation. His grandfather had been preserving the skills Everett would need to rediscover what the earlier generations had hidden. The question remained, why had the Hendersons been forced to leave? What accident had convinced them to abandon their legacy? Sleep eluded him as he studied his grandfather's journal with new purpose, cross-referencing the Henderson map with the surveyor's notes. By dawn, he had formed a rough understanding of where the well might be located and how the barn's structure related to it. What he lacked was proof, something concrete to establish his claim before Sterling Maddox found a way to take it from him. The early morning light cast long shadows as Everett and Lily approached the barn again. He'd been reluctant to bring her, but leaving her alone seemed more dangerous given Sterling's interest in their affairs. Besides, her bright spirit might see things his focused attention missed. "Pa, look at the rocks!" Lily called from the side of the barn where she'd wandered while he unlocked the door. "They make a circle." Everett joined her, immediately recognizing what her fresh eyes had spotted. A formation of stones, seemingly random to casual observation, formed a perfect circle approximately 3 feet in diameter. More significantly, the stones matched a pattern indicated in the Henderson map, a surface marker for something below. "You've got sharp eyes, Lily girl. Those rocks aren't there by accident." She beamed at the praise, then knelt to examine them more closely. "This one's different. It has lines on it." The stone she indicated bore faint carvings, directional markers that matched those on the barn wall, but would be nearly invisible to anyone not looking specifically for them. It was another piece of the puzzle, confirmation that the Hendersons and his grandfather had created an elaborate system to both hide and mark the well's location. Inside the barn, Everett began taking precise measurements based on the map and journal notes, marking positions on the floor with chalk. If his calculations were correct, the well itself was located beneath the central section of the barn, ingeniously hidden below what appeared to be solid flooring. Lily watched with fascination as her father paced off distances and consulted his grandfather's journal. "What are we looking for, Pa?" "Water, Lily, but not just any water, special water that could help a lot of people if we find it." The sound of approaching horsemen interrupted their exploration. Through the gaps in the barn walls, Everett recognized Sterling's distinctive black stallion, accompanied by several riders. This wasn't a casual visit, it was a show of force. Lily, remember what I told you yesterday? If things seem wrong, you run straight to Mr. Whitman's store. Don't stop for anyone except Thomas himself. She nodded solemnly, eyes wide as the horses drew closer. Everett quickly gathered his grandfather's journal and the Henderson map, securing them in his saddlebag. Whatever happened next, he couldn't risk Sterling discovering the full extent of what he knew. The barn door swung open, revealing Sterling flanked by James Cooper and two other men Everett recognized as ranch hands, known for enforcing their employer's will when necessary. Sterling's eyes took in the chalk marks on the floor, his expression hardening as he realized Everett was already mapping the property. Making improvements to your investment, Kane? Seems an awful lot of planning for a man of your means. Everett straightened, keeping his voice level despite the implied threat of four men blocking the only exit. Just getting the lay of the land, Mr. Maddox, as any property owner would. Sterling stepped further inside, his boots leaving impressions in the dust that had accumulated over the floor. The other men remained by the door, effectively blocking escape. Property owner, such a formal term for 50 cents worth of entitlement. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, Kane. I believe I was too hasty in my assessment. $5 seems inadequate for a man's dreams. Let me offer you 20 instead, for the deed and any documents you might have acquired related to this property. The specific mention of documents confirmed what Everett already suspected. Sterling knew more than he was revealing. Someone had informed him about Martha Henderson's letter, which meant Violet's involvement wasn't as secret as they'd hoped. That's generous, Mr. Maddox, but as I said yesterday, I'm not interested in selling. Sterling's practiced smile faded, revealing the cold calculation beneath. You misunderstand me, Kane. I'm not making a request. I'm offering you the opportunity to walk away with something rather than nothing. Cooper shifted uncomfortably at his employer's tone, his eyes darting to Lily, who stood partially hidden behind her father. The other men moved their hands to rest near their belts, where pistols were visibly holstered. Mr. Maddox, there's a child present. Maybe we should... Sterling cut him off with a sharp gesture. The child should learn early how the territory works, Cooper. Resources go to those who know how to claim and defend them, not to dreamers who stumble onto things they don't understand. He turned his attention back to Everett, all pretense of civility gone. The Henderson property has been of interest to me for many years. Jacob Henderson refused my generous offers, and you see where that stubbornness led him. Running in the night like a thief, abandoning 3 generations of family legacy. I'd hate to see history repeat itself with you and your daughter. The threat was unmistakable, made more chilling by its delivery in such measured tones. Everett felt Lily's small hand clutch the back of his jacket, her body trembling slightly. Are you threatening a man on his own property, Mr. Maddox? That's not how the law works, even in this territory. Law! Sterling practically spat the word. Law is a luxury for those who can afford to wait for justice. Out here, a man makes his own arrangements. I control the water rights for 50 miles in every direction. Without my goodwill, no ranch survives, no crop grows, no family prospers. That's the only law that matters when the rivers run dry. Everett held his ground, though every instinct screamed to get Lily to safety. Then I suggest you take your grievance to the territorial court. Until then, I'll thank you to leave my property. For a moment, the tension in the barn was thick enough to cut. Then Sterling laughed, the sound devoid of humor. Cooper, it seems Mr. Kane needs time to consider his position more carefully. Perhaps when he's had a chance to reflect on the realities of his situation, he'll reach a more reasonable conclusion. Sterling turned to leave but paused at the doorway. 1 week, Kane. Consider it a courtesy for a man with a child to consider. After that, I can't guarantee the safety of your investment. The riders departed, dust rising from their horses' hooves as they galloped back toward town. Everett released the breath he'd been holding, feeling Lily's arms wrap around his waist in a tight hug. Are they going to hurt us, Pa? He knelt to her level, meeting her frightened gaze with as much reassurance as he could muster. No, Lily girl. Men like Sterling Maddox make threats because they're afraid. And do you know what they're most afraid of? She shook her head, eyes wide. They're afraid of people who aren't scared of them. People who stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. His words sounded braver than he felt. Sterling's threats weren't empty. He had the power and influence to make their lives impossible if he chose to. Whatever was hidden beneath the barn floor had to be significant enough to justify such risks. With renewed determination, Everett returned to his measurements. The Henderson map indicated a specific section of floorings that concealed access to the well below. If he could locate it before Sterling returned with more men or legal manipulation, he might have a chance to establish his claim officially. The afternoon sun cast shifting patterns through the gaps in the barn walls as Everett systematically examined each section of flooring. Lily helped by looking for any boards that had seemed different from the others, loose, newer, or specially marked. Her smaller fingers could feel variations in the wood that his calloused hands might miss. After hours of careful examination, a pattern emerged. The central section of flooring showed subtle differences in construction. The boards ran perpendicular to those surrounding them, and the nails securing them were newer, less rusted than others throughout the barn. "I think we found it, Lily. This section is different from the rest." She knelt beside him, running her hand over the boards. "It feels different too, Pa. Like it moves a little when you press hard." Everett applied pressure to different points, feeling a slight give that shouldn't exist in solid flooring. Using his pocket knife, he carefully probed the seams between boards, searching for a mechanism or release that would grant access to whatever lay beneath. The sound of the general store wagon approaching was a welcome interruption. Thomas Whitman had been his grandfather's friend for decades, one of the few original settlers still living in the territory. If anyone might have additional knowledge about the Henderson property, it would be Thomas. The elderly shopkeeper descended from his wagon with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned to conserve energy. His sharp eyes took in the barn's interior with a single sweep, noting the chalk marks in Everett's tools laid out on the floor. "Heard Sterling paid you a visit this morning. Thought you might appreciate some supplies and friendly conversation after such distinguished company." Thomas's dry tone brought a smile to Everett's face despite the circumstances. Lily rushed to help the old man with the basket of food and canteens of fresh water he had brought, her earlier fear temporarily forgotten in the presence of another friendly face. Once Lily was occupied arranging their impromptu meal, Thomas lowered his voice. "Sterling stopped by the store after leaving here, asked a lot of questions about your grandfather's surveying work, made it clear my water deliveries might become unreliable if I couldn't remember anything useful." Everett wasn't surprised. Sterling was systematically pressuring anyone who might help him, isolating them before making his next move. "Did you tell him anything?" Thomas snorted, his weathered face creasing with indignation. "I've been in this territory since before Sterling Maddox's father owned his first cow. Told him my memories have been failing lately. Can hardly remember my own name, let alone surveying work from 30 years ago." His expression grew more serious as he glanced toward the floor Everett had been examining. "You're looking in the right place, son. Jacob Henderson spent more time working on that section of flooring than any other part of this barn. Used to joke it was the foundation of his fortune, though most folks thought he was talking about the barn's storage capacity." Thomas knelt with some difficulty beside Everett, his gnarled fingers tracing the seams between boards with surprising precision. Henderson was clever about hiding things. Never made anything obvious, but never made it impossible either, if you knew what to look for. The old man's fingers stopped at a seemingly unremarkable knot in one of the boards. "This here, it's not natural. Hand-carved to look like a knot, but it's actually a pivot point." Thomas pressed the false knot and rotated it slightly. A soft click resonated from beneath the floor, and a seam appeared where none had been visible before. A 3-foot square section of flooring was now outlined, with small brass hinges revealed along one edge. "Henderson and your grandfather weren't just friends, Everett. They were partners in protecting something they believed was too important to fall into the wrong hands. Sterling's been trying to find it for years, ever since Jacob refused to sell during the drought of '79. Everett carefully lifted the trapdoor, revealing a small chamber below. Set into the earth was a circular metal cover approximately 2 feet in diameter, its surface engraved with the same surveyor's marks he'd seen on the barn wall and the Henderson map. The cover itself was secured with a complex locking mechanism that would require specific knowledge to open safely. "Is that what I think it is?" Everett's voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, his expression solemn. An artesian well with enough pressure and volume to irrigate half the territory if managed properly. Henderson's grandfather discovered it during the settlement drought, when 3 out of every 4 families abandoned their claims for lack of water. Why hide it? Why not develop it? Thomas glanced toward Lily, ensuring she was still out of earshot. Because they saw what happened in California when gold was discovered. Men killed for rocks they could put in their pockets. Imagine what they'd do for something that could make barren land bloom in a territory where water means everything. The old man's fingers traced the locking mechanism with familiarity that suggested he'd seen it before. They sealed it until the territory had proper laws and enough decent folks to ensure it wouldn't become another source of violence and corruption. They were waiting for the right time, the right person. The implications settled heavily on Everett's shoulders. His grandfather hadn't just left him surveying knowledge. He'd left him a legacy and responsibility that extended beyond his own interests. The well wasn't just a potential fortune, it was a resource that could transform the entire region if managed properly. And if Sterling gets control of it? Thomas's expression darkened. He already controls most water sources in the territory. With this one, he'd have absolute power over who succeeds and who fails, who stays and who's forced to leave. No farm or ranch could operate without his permission. No town could grow without his blessing. The sound of hooves approaching sent Thomas quickly closing the trap door and spreading hay over the section to conceal their discovery. Everett moved to the barn door, relieved to see Violet McCall rather than Sterling's men. Her expression, however, brought no comfort. She dismounted quickly, her normally composed demeanor visibly shaken. Sterling's called an emergency meeting of the Water Commission for tomorrow. He's filing a claim that challenges your ownership based on historical water rights that predate your purchase. He's bringing in Judge Harmon from the county seat, his former business partner. Thomas joined them at the door, his jaw set in a grim line. Harmon's a puppet. He'll rule however Sterling tells him to. Violet nodded, her eyes conveying the severity of the situation. There's more. Sterling's men have been asking about Lily at the school, claiming they're concerned about her welfare living in such unstable circumstances. They're suggesting the territorial orphanage might be a more appropriate placement while her father's legal troubles are resolved. Cold fear gripped Everett's heart. Using Lily as leverage was lower than he'd expected, even from Sterling. The territorial orphanage was little more than a workhouse, and children placed there often disappeared into servitude arrangements with wealthy families needing cheap labor. Thomas laid a steadying hand on Everett's arm. Sterling's getting desperate. He knows you're close to finding something he's been seeking for years. The legal challenge is just a delaying tactic while he figures out how to take direct action. Violet moved closer, lowering her voice though no one else was present. My father says we need to be prepared for Sterling to take matters into his own hands. He's not a man who accepts defeat, especially when water rights are involved. The 3 adults exchanged grave looks, each understanding what wasn't being said aloud. Sterling Maddox had built his empire by controlling water in a territory where drought was a constant threat. Men who challenged his authority tended to encounter misfortune, accidents, fires, unexplained property damage that forced them to sell at desperate prices. Everett made a swift decision. Thomas, can you take Lily back to town with you? I need a few hours to document what we found before Sterling makes his next move. Thomas nodded, understanding the urgency. The territorial surveyor will be passing through Green River next week. If you can get proof of the well to him before Sterling's legal maneuvers take effect, you might have a chance at official recognition of your claim. As Thomas and Lily departed with promises to return before nightfall, Everett and Violet worked quickly to document their discovery. He made detailed drawings of the well cover and locking mechanism, while Violet copied sections from his grandfather's journal that referenced the Henderson property and artesian well. The mechanisms are ingenious, Everett observed as he examined the well cover more closely. It's designed to release slowly, controlling the pressure so the water doesn't burst forth all at once. Henderson's grandfather was thinking generations ahead. He built this to last a century or more. Violet traced the surveyor's marks on the cover, her expression thoughtful. My father says the drought this year is already worse than the one in '79. Sterling's charging triple the normal rates for water access, and 3 families on the North Ridge have already packed up and left. Her implication was clear. The well wasn't just a private resource, but potentially a lifeline for the entire community. If managed properly, it could break Sterling's stranglehold on the territory's water supply and provide relief to dozens of struggling families. As the afternoon sun cast longer shadows through the barn, they assembled their documentation into a packet that could be sent to the territorial surveyor. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it might buy enough time to establish Everett's legitimate claim before Sterling found a way to seize control. The sound of multiple horses approaching shattered the quiet concentration of their work. This time, there was no mistaking the purposeful rhythm of men riding with intent. Everett quickly secured the trapdoor and scattered hay over it while Violet gathered their papers. Sterling's men, at least 6 of them, Violet whispered as she peered through a gap in the barn wall. And Sterling himself. They're armed, Everett. There was no time to run. The riders were already surrounding the barn. Everett quickly tucked the documentation packet into Violet's satchel. His decision immediate and final. Take the back path through the creek bed. It's out of sight from here. Get these papers to Thomas and tell him to send them to the territorial surveyor immediately. Then find Lily and stay with her. Violet hesitated, reluctant to leave him alone to face Sterling's men. What about you? I'll buy you time. Sterling doesn't know exactly what we found yet. I can keep him talking while you get clear. The determination in his voice left no room for argument. Violet slipped out through a gap in the rear wall of the barn just as Sterling's voice boomed from outside the main entrance. Kane, I know you're in there. Our conversation from this morning isn't finished. Everett moved to the front of the barn, positioning himself so his body blocked any view of the disturbed flooring. The packet of documentation was his only real leverage now. If it reached the territorial surveyor, Sterling's influence might be temporarily checked by official investigation. The barn door swung open to reveal Sterling flanked by 6 men, including James Cooper, whose expression betrayed discomfort with the situation. Unlike the earlier visit, there was no pretense of civility now. The men spread out in a semicircle, effectively blocking any path to the door. I've been patient with you, Kane, Sterling began, his voice carrying the certainty of a man accustomed to getting his way. I've made generous offers. I've given you time to reconsider your position. That patience has expired. Everett maintained a calm demeanor despite the racing of his heart. We seem to have different definitions of patience, Mr. Maddox, and of generosity. Sterling's eyes narrowed at the defiance. He stepped further into the barn, glancing around for signs of what Everett might have discovered. I've filed papers with Judge Harmon contesting your ownership of this property based on historical water rights that predate your purchase. The hearing is tomorrow, and I think you'll find the outcome predictable. Predictable because you own the judge? Everett's direct challenge caused several of Sterling's men to shift uncomfortably. Even corrupt deals preferred the appearance of legitimacy. Sterling's face flushed with anger, but his voice remained controlled. The law serves those who understand how to use it, Kane, just as water flows to those who know how to direct it. He moved closer, his next words meant for Everett alone. I know what's hidden here. I've known for years, but the old fool Henderson took his secrets to the grave rather than be reasonable. You're just a surveyor's grandson playing at things beyond your understanding. Then why do you want this property so badly? Everett countered. If I'm wrong about its value, you shouldn't care who owns it. The logic of the question struck a nerve. Sterling's carefully maintained composure slipped, revealing the obsession beneath. Because water is power in this territory. Control the water, and you control everything. Who succeeds, who fails, who stays, who goes. I've spent 30 years building that control, and I won't let some half-broke widower with delusions of grandeur threaten what I've built. The vehemence of Sterling's outburst created a moment of tense silence. Even his own men seemed taken aback by the naked ambition in their employer's words. James Cooper's gaze met Everett's briefly, something like recognition passing between them. 2 men who understood the difference between earning respect and demanding it. The floorboards beneath them creaked as weight shifted. Sterling's attention snapped to the sound, his eyes tracking to the section of flooring Everett had been examining. Despite Everett's efforts to conceal their discovery, Sterling's keen observation noted the subtle differences in that section of the barn. So that's where old Henderson hid it, Sterling mused, a predatory smile spreading across his face. Right under everyone's noses all these years. He gestured to his men. Tear up that section of flooring. Whatever's underneath belongs to me by right of prior claim. Two men moved forward, but Cooper hesitated, his sense of justice apparently conflicting with his loyalty. "Mr. Maddox, we don't have legal authority to—" Sterling cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I'm the authority in this territory, Cooper. When the rivers run dry, men don't look to judges for salvation. They look to whoever controls the water." As the men approached the concealed trapdoor, a small figure appeared in the barn doorway. Lily, her eyes wide with fear but her chin set with determination. "Pa, Thomas says the sheriff's coming. He's bringing papers from the territorial office." Her sudden appearance froze everyone in place. Sterling's men exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence wavering at the mention of territorial authority. Sterling himself narrowed his eyes, trying to determine if the child was bluffing or if Thomas Whitman had indeed managed to contact territorial officials. The moment of hesitation was all Everett needed. He moved swiftly to Lily's side, positioning himself between her and Sterling's men. "Your legal challenge hasn't been heard yet, Mr. Maddox. Until a judge rules otherwise, this property and everything on it belongs to me. I suggest you take your grievance to the proper authorities rather than attempting to settle it with force." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before Sterling gestured for his men to stand down. His cold smile suggested this was merely a tactical retreat rather than surrender. "Very well, Kane, we'll let the law decide my way. But know this, by sundown tomorrow, that well will be mine, along with everything else you think you own. Men like you don't win against men like me. That's not how the territory works." As Sterling and his men departed, Everett knelt beside Lily, checking her for any signs of harm or distress. Her small face was pale but composed, showing a courage that belied her 10 years. "There's no sheriff coming, is there?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Thomas said to say that to give you time. He said sometimes a good story is better than a gun when you're outnumbered." Despite the gravity of their situation, Everett smiled at his daughter's resourcefulness. Thomas Whitman had been quick-thinking enough to use Lily as an unexpected ally, knowing Sterling would hesitate to act violently in front of a child. Violet appeared from her hiding place near the back of the barn, her face etched with relief at finding them both unharmed. "I couldn't leave," she admitted, "not with you facing them alone." The three of them stood in the fading afternoon light, aware that they had won only a brief reprieve. Sterling would return, with legal authority, with more men, with whatever resources necessary to claim what he believed was rightfully his. "What do we do now, Pa?" Lily's small voice broke the silence, her hand finding his with complete trust. Everett looked down at his daughter, then at Violet, then at the concealed trapdoor that held a resource powerful enough to transform the territory. The answer came with clarity, born of necessity. "We protect what matters, Lily girl. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who needs it." As shadows lengthened across the barn floor, they began formulating a plan, not just to defend their claim, but to reveal the truth before Sterling could bury it beneath legal manipulation and threats. Whatever happened at tomorrow's hearing, the knowledge of the artesian well's existence needed to spread beyond those who would control it for personal gain. The well wasn't just water, it was hope in a land where drought was always one season away. Hope worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth sharing. Just as Henderson and his grandfather had intended all those years ago when they sealed it away, waiting for the right time and the right hands to bring its blessing to light. Dawn painted the hills in hues of amber and gold, but Everett and Lily couldn't appreciate the beauty from their hiding place in the abandoned hunter's cabin. 2 weeks had passed since their confrontation with Sterling, and the small structure that had once served as a seasonal shelter for trappers now provided their only refuge. Perched on a ridge overlooking the Henderson property, it offered both concealment and a clear view of Sterling's operation below. Everett adjusted the spyglass, focusing on the activity surrounding the barn. What had once been a carefully disguised structure was now partially dismantled, its weathered boards stripped away to reveal the solid construction beneath. A team of men worked methodically, directed by James Cooper, whose reluctance seemed to have given way to professional efficiency. Most concerning was the arrival of heavy drilling equipment, the kind used by professional well diggers who didn't need surveyor's marks to find what lay beneath the earth. Lily huddled nearby, wrapped in a blanket Thomas had smuggled to them along with provisions. The cabin's dirt floor and drafty walls provided minimal comfort, but she hadn't complained once. Instead, she watched her father with quiet determination, absorbing his tension and reflecting it back as resolve. Sterling's men are digging in the wrong place, Pa, she observed, her eyes tracking the workers who focused their efforts on the eastern side of the barn. You said the well was under the middle part. Everett lowered the spyglass, struck once again by his daughter's perceptiveness. She was right. Sterling's team was excavating in a methodical grid pattern, but they had started at the perimeter rather than the center, where the trap door concealed the well's entrance. It was the approach of men who knew something valuable was hidden, but lacked the specific knowledge to locate it precisely. That buys us time, Lily girl, but not much. Professional diggers like that will find it eventually, even without the map. He tucked the spyglass away, mentally calculating how long it might take Sterling's men to reach the central section of the barn floor. 3 days, perhaps 4 if they continued their current pattern. After that, all evidence of the Henderson family's careful preservation would be destroyed in the Sterling's rush to claim the resource beneath. The sound of approaching footsteps sent them both into practiced stillness. Few people knew of the cabin's existence, and fewer still would have reason to climb the steep trail leading to it. Everett positioned himself between the door and Lily, one hand reaching for the old hunting rifle Thomas had provided, a last resort he hoped never to use. The familiar knock pattern melted their tension. Thomas Whitman's weathered face appeared in the doorway, his breathing labored from the climb. The elderly shopkeeper carried a pack laden with supplies, his weekly delivery that had become their lifeline to the world beyond their hiding place. Town's buzzing like a hornet's nest, Thomas reported as he lowered his burden to the cabin floor. Sterling's convinced everyone you've fled the territory, even posted a notice in the newspaper thanking folks for information that led to your apprehension in Wyoming. Claims you abandoned your property after realizing it was worthless. A clever tactic, creating a fiction that discouraged anyone from looking for Everett while establishing a narrative of abandonment that would strengthen Sterling's claim to the property. The territorial judge had ruled in Sterling's favor at the emergency hearing, granting him temporary access rights based on vague historical claims and Everett's supposed flight from justice. Lily helped Thomas unpack the provisions, organizing them with the careful efficiency of a child who had learned early that resources were precious. Fresh bread, dried meat, 2 canteens of water, and, most valuable, information scribbled on paper tucked inside a hollowed loaf. The drought's getting worse, Thomas continued, settling his tired bones on a rough-hewn stool. 3 more families packed up yesterday. The Johnsons, Clarks, and old Wilson from the North Ridge. Sterling's tripled water rates again, says it's due to limited supply. He knelt to Lily's level, his voice softening. Your teacher, Miss McCall, asks after you every day. Says she's keeping your schoolwork ready for when you return. Lily's face brightened at the mention of Violet, but Everett noted the careful phrasing. Violet had paid a price for helping them. Sterling had arranged her dismissal from teaching position on trumped-up charges of unsuitability. She now helped her father at their struggling ranch, but continued to be their most valuable ally in town, listening for useful information and passing it to Thomas. Thomas withdrew a folded newspaper from his coat, his expression grave as he handed it to Everett. Sterling's brought in a mining engineer from Denver, man named Hollister, who specializes in underground water sources. Word is he'll find it within a week, with or without your grandfather's maps. The newspaper confirmed Thomas's warning. A small article announced the arrival of Edward Hollister, renowned hydrological engineer, to assist with water development projects on the Maddox holdings. The technical expertise that had taken generations of Hendersons and Canes to accumulate was being replaced by modern scientific methods and expensive equipment. Lily had wandered to the cabin's single window, staring down at the activity surrounding their barn. They're bringing more wagons, Pa, big ones with machines. The urgency of their situation pressed down on Everett like a physical weight. Every day spent hiding was another day for Sterling to strengthen his position. The documentation packet they'd sent to the territorial surveyor had disappeared en route. Intercepted, Thomas suspected, by men loyal to Sterling. Their legal recourse was rapidly vanishing and along with their time. As Thomas prepared to leave, Lily surprised them both by asking a question that cut to the heart of their dilemma. Why don't we just tell everyone about the well, Pa? If everybody knows, Mr. Maddox can't keep it for himself, can he? The simplicity of her suggestions sparked a realization in Everett. Sterling's power came from controlling not just water but information. Who knew what? Who had access to which resources? The well's value to him wasn't just its capacity, but the advantage that came from exclusive control. What if that advantage was eliminated? Thomas's eyes met Everett's, a similar thought clearly forming in the older man's mind. She might be onto something, son. Sterling operates in shadows, always has, brings in territorial judges secretly, makes deals behind closed doors, threatens folks individually so they don't realize they're all being squeezed the same way. The seed of a plan began to form, not just to reclaim their property, but to expose the truth about the artesian well before Sterling could establish exclusive control. If knowledge of its existence spread beyond those who could be threatened or bribed into silence, Sterling's monopoly would be compromised regardless of legal ownership. Thomas departed with promises to contact their small network of allies, leaving Everett and Lily to develop their strategy. As darkness fell, Everett unfolded his grandfather's journal across his knees, the leather binding worn smooth from weeks of constant handling. Within its pages lay not just the location of the Henderson well, but detailed maps of potential water sources throughout the territory, knowledge that could transform the region if shared rather than hoarded. Lily nestled against his side, her small finger tracing the survey marks that indicated underground water flows. What happens if we can't get the barn back, Pa? The question carried implications beyond property ownership. It touched on their future, their safety, their place in a community increasingly dominated by Sterling's influence. Everett closed the journal, choosing his words carefully for a child who deserved truth without despair. Sometimes the fight isn't about getting something back, Lily girl. Sometimes it's about making sure the right thing happens, even if we don't get to be the ones who make it happen. Her brow furrowed as she processed this perspective, so different from the simple justice of childhood stories where good triumphed and was rewarded. It ain't fair, she murmured, unconsciously slipping into the vernacular of her schoolmates. Everett brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, noting how much she resembled her mother in moments of deep thought. The unfairness of life was a harsh lesson he'd hoped to postpone, but their circumstances had accelerated her education in the world's hard truths. The next morning brought unexpected hope in the form of William Maddox, Sterling's son, whose approach to the cabin Lily spotted while gathering kindling near the stream. Unlike their other visitors, William made no attempt at stealth, riding openly up the trail on a chestnut mare, whose quality marked her as stable-bred rather than range-caught. Everett met him outside, rifle in hand though not raised, a precaution rather than a threat. William dismounted, maintaining a respectful distance as he removed his hat, revealing features that resembled his father's, but lacked the hardness years of ambition had carved into Sterling's face. "I'm not here on my father's behalf, Mr. Kane." Quite the opposite. William's educated Eastern accent contrasted with the frontier speech of most territorial residents. He'd spent years at agricultural college in Pennsylvania, returning with modern irrigation knowledge that his father largely ignored in favor of established methods of water control. Lily appeared at the cabin door, curiosity overcoming caution. William acknowledged her with a genuine smile, then refocused on Everett with newfound urgency. "They're bringing in Hollister's drilling equipment tomorrow. He's identified the aquifer that feeds the artesian system and plans to tap it directly rather than searching for the existing well. If he succeeds, the pressure from the original well could be compromised permanently." The news struck Everett like a physical blow. Henderson and his grandfather had carefully engineered the well to maintain optimal pressure and flow over generations. Hollister's modern approach threatened not just their claim to the water, but the integrity of the resource itself. William glanced back toward the trail, clearly anxious about being followed. "My father doesn't know I'm here. He believes I'm surveying the northern properties for irrigation potential." Their unexpected ally withdrew a folded document from his jacket, detailed drawings of Hollister's drilling plan with annotations in William's precise handwriting. The diagrams confirmed Everett's worst fears. The engineer planned to penetrate the aquifer at multiple points, potentially disrupting the natural pressure that made the artesian well so valuable. "I studied natural springs and aquifer systems back east," William explained, his expression troubled. "What they're planning isn't just theft of your property rights, it's destruction of a natural resource that could serve the entire territory if managed properly." His words carried the weight of professional assessment rather than mere sympathy. William understood, perhaps better than anyone except Everett himself, exactly what was at stake. Not just ownership of a water source, but preservation of a system that had functioned perfectly for generations. Why are you helping us? Lily's direct question cut through the technical discussion, addressing the human element that adults often circled around. William's expression softened as he considered how to explain complex loyalties to a child. My mother died when I was younger than you, during the drought of '79. Typhoid from contaminated water. My father promised her he'd make sure no one in this territory ever suffered from water scarcity again. He paused, the personal cost of his next words evident in his face. It was a good promise, but somewhere along the way, controlling water became more important to him than sharing it. That's not what she would have wanted. The revelation added crucial context to Sterling's obsession. What had begun as a grieving husband's vow had warped over decades into something his wife would never have recognized. William was honoring his mother's memory by opposing his father's methods, a painful position for a son who clearly wished to respect both parents. As William prepared to depart, he offered one final piece of information. The territorial surveyor returns from the Northern Circuit next week. If you can provide evidence of your claim directly to him, it might at least slow my father's operation until a proper investigation can be conducted. It was a slim hope, but more than they'd had that morning. William mounted his horse, his posture reflecting the burden of divided loyalties. My father isn't the villain most people think he is, Mr. Kane. He's a man who lost something precious and never recovered from that wound. But that doesn't excuse what he's doing now. With those parting words, William rode back down the trail, leaving Everett and Lily with new information and a shortened timeline. Whatever action they planned needed to happen before Hollister's drilling began the next day. That evening, as darkness provided cover, Everett and Lily made their way down the ridge to Thomas's store at the edge of town. A back entrance allowed them to slip inside unnoticed, where they found not just Thomas waiting, but Violet McCall and her father James, whose grim expression spoke of recent difficulties. James McCall's once prosperous small ranch was suffering under Sterling's water restrictions, his cattle thin and crops failing despite his best efforts. His weather-beaten face showed new lines of worry, but his handshake remained firm as he greeted Everett. Sterling's men came by yesterday, checking fences along our property line. Said they were surveying for a new water channel that would cross our southeast corner. I told them McCall land stays McCall land. This morning, our west pasture access was mysteriously blocked by a fallen tree, too clean a cut to be natural. The implication was clear. Sterling was applying pressure to the McCall property, identifying James as an ally of Everett's and targeting him accordingly. It was a pattern repeated throughout the territory whenever someone challenged Sterling's authority. Violet's dismissal from the school had become official, announced in the same newspaper that reported Everett's fictional capture in Wyoming. The stated reason, moral unsuitability, was vague enough to damage her reputation while specific enough to prevent her from teaching elsewhere in the territory. Despite these personal costs, their small alliance remained committed to opposing Sterling's control. Thomas spread a map of the town and surrounding properties across his backroom table, waited at the corners with merchandise from his store shelves. Sterling's expecting trouble, but he's looking in the wrong direction, Thomas explained, his gnarled finger tracing the routes leading to the Henderson barn. He's posted men along the main trails and at river crossings. Expects you to try reclaiming the property directly. It was a logical assumption. Most men would focus on defending their legal claim to the property itself, but Everett's priority had shifted. Protecting the well's integrity and ensuring its discovery became public knowledge now took precedence over personal ownership. Violet pointed to the newspaper she'd brought, folded open to a notice announcing a Territorial Water Commission meeting in 3 days. Sterling chairs the commission, but every rancher and property owner has the right to attend and speak. It's the first public gathering since he started the drilling operation. The timing was perfect, a public forum where Sterling couldn't control who spoke or who listened, attended by the very people most affected by water access issues. If they could present evidence of the artesian well's existence before the entire community, Sterling's ability to monopolize the resource would be severely compromised. James McCall leaned forward, his voice lowered though no one else was present. I've got the documentation you sent with Violet, hidden it where Sterling's men won't think to look. But getting it to the territorial surveyor means crossing 60 miles of Sterling-controlled land. The challenge seemed insurmountable until Lily, who had been quietly arranging supplies Thomas had gathered, offered an unexpected solution. Mrs. Peterson's boy Billy is riding to Green River tomorrow with mail for his uncle's store. He could take the papers to the surveyor there. The adults exchanged surprised glances, impressed by both the simplicity and effectiveness of the suggestion. Billy Peterson was 14, considered too young to be of interest to Sterling's men, and made the journey to his uncle's store in Green River regularly. As a mail carrier's son, he was trusted with documents and known for his reliability. Our move needs to be two-pronged, Everett decided, studying the map with renewed focus. We need the territorial surveyor's official acknowledgement for legal standing, but we also need public awareness to prevent Sterling from burying the discovery regardless of legal outcome. The plan took shape over the next hour, roles assigned based on each person's strengths and position in the community. Thomas would arrange for Billy Peterson to transport the documentation to Green River. Violet would prepare a simplified explanation of the artesian well's significance that could be quickly understood by the commission attendees. James McCall would gather supporting testimonies from other ranchers affected by Sterling's water control. Everett's task was the most dangerous. He needed to retrieve the original Henderson deed and additional documentation hidden in a secret compartment within the barn, evidence that would prove both his rightful ownership and the well's existence. Without these original documents, their case would rest solely on copies and verbal claims that Sterling could easily dismiss. The next evening, under cover of darkness, Everett and James McCall made their way through the dense thicket that bordered the Henderson property from the west, an approach Sterling's men had deemed too difficult to guard continuously. The drilling equipment Hollister had brought stood silent, awaiting the morning's operation. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter of the barn, rifles slung over their shoulders, more concerned with preventing interference than actually watching for specific threats. Months working his small ranch had made James McCall an expert at silent movement, skills he now employed to create a diversion at the far edge of the property. A carefully placed lantern and triggered collapse of brush created the impression of someone trying to approach from the east, drawing both guards' attention and allowing Everett to slip inside the barn through a section where the outer boards had been removed. The interior was transformed from when he'd last seen it. Sterling's men had stripped away much of the careful concealment the Hendersons had constructed, exposing the barn's true structure. The central floor section remained intact, however, as Hollister had focused his preliminary work on mapping the aquifer, rather than searching for the existing access point. Everett moved silently to the trap door concealed beneath scattered hay. The lock mechanism Thomas had shown them remained undisturbed. Hollister's modern methods had actually worked in their favor, as he considered the old surveyor's marks irrelevant compared to his scientific equipment readings. The hidden compartment beneath the trap door contained exactly what Everett sought: the original Henderson deed with its attached water rights documentation, additional maps showing the well's connection to the broader aquifer system, and a sealed metal tube containing letters between Henderson's grandfather and Everett's great-grandfather detailing their agreement to protect the water source. He had just secured these treasures in his jacket when voices outside signaled trouble. The diversion had been discovered, and James McCall's voice rose in protest as he was apprehended by the guards. Everett froze, calculating his options as footsteps approached the barn door. For the good of the territory, get those papers to safety. James McCall's shout carried clearly, a deliberate signal to Everett that he was sacrificing his freedom to ensure the mission's success. The barn door swung open, lantern light spilling across the disturbed floor. Everett pressed himself into the shadows behind a stack of lumber, watching as James was dragged inside by 2 guards, his face already showing a darkening bruise from rough handling. "Look what we caught trying to sneak onto Mr. Maddox's property," one guard announced, shoving James to his knees. "Says he was just looking for a stray cow, but he had this on him." The guard held up a folded paper that Everett recognized as a copy of the Henderson map. A deliberate plant, part of their strategy to focus attention on James while Everett escaped with the original documents. James McCall met Everett's hidden gaze briefly, a silent communication passing between them. The plan had worked, but at significant personal cost. James would face Sterling's retribution, likely imprisonment on false charges and further pressure on his already struggling ranch. When the guards dragged James away towards Sterling's main house where the rancher maintained an office, Everett seized his narrow window of opportunity. Slipping from the barn through the same opening he'd entered, he made his way back to the thicket, the precious documents secure against his chest. By dawn, he had returned to the hunter's cabin where Lily waited anxiously with Thomas. The old shopkeeper's face fell when Everett explained James McCall's capture. Sterling will make an example of him, Thomas predicted grimly. Public humiliation, false charges, maybe even transfer to the territorial prison if he thinks it necessary to send a message. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Everett's shoulders. James had volunteered for the mission knowing the risks, but that didn't ease the guilt of watching a good man suffer for helping their cause. Lily's small hand slipped into his, her eyes solemn with understanding beyond her years. "We have to make it worth it, Pa. Mr. McCall gave us a chance, and we can't waste it." Her simple articulation of their duty cleared Everett's mind of doubt. They had the documents, and now they needed to use them effectively, not just to reclaim their property, but to ensure James McCall's sacrifice served the greater purpose of breaking Sterling's water monopoly. The next morning brought news that confirmed their fears. James McCall had been publicly accused of trespassing and attempted theft, paraded through town in handcuffs before being locked in the small jail adjacent to the marshal's office. Sterling had filed formal charges, using his influence to ensure the territorial marshal treated the case as a serious offense rather than a minor trespass. More devastating was the news Violet brought when she secretly visited the cabin that afternoon. Her dismissal from teaching had been followed by an eviction notice from the small house she rented in town, another property controlled indirectly by Sterling through one of his business partners. "They're making an example of father and daughter both," she explained, her voice steady despite the personal cost. "And Thomas's store has been declared off-limits to Sterling's ranch hands and anyone doing business with Maddox Enterprises. Half his customers disappeared overnight." The systematic isolation of their allies was Sterling's standard tactic. Identify those who opposed him, then apply pressure from multiple directions until resistance became too costly to maintain. It was effective precisely because it targeted not just individuals, but their livelihoods and community standing. Despite these setbacks, their plan proceeded. Billy Peterson had successfully departed for Green River with the documentation for the territorial surveyor, traveling a route that avoided Sterling's main checkpoints. Thomas had quietly spread word of the Water Commission meeting, ensuring attendance by ranchers and townspeople who normally might have skipped such a procedural gathering. Violet had prepared simple diagrams explaining how an artesian well worked and why the Henderson discovery was significant for the entire territory. These would be distributed at the meeting, providing context for Everett's planned revelation of the original documents. The growing pressure from Sterling's operations created unexpected support for their cause. As water rates increased and more families faced the prospect of abandoning their properties, resentment towards Sterling's monopoly bubbled just beneath the surface of public deference. The territory was a powder keg awaiting a spark. 2 days later, as they made final preparations for the Water Commission meeting, William Maddox appeared at the cabin again, this time with news that shifted the timeline dramatically. Hollister struck water this morning, but not how they expected. They penetrated the aquifer boundary incorrectly and had to cap the borehole immediately. There was too much pressure. It nearly caused a blowout. The engineering error had temporarily halted operations, but William's expression conveyed the gravity of the situation. "My father's bringing in more equipment from Cheyenne, heavy machinery that can tap the aquifer regardless of pressure issues. It arrives tomorrow on the afternoon train." This development compressed their timeline from days to hours. Once Sterling's new equipment arrived, the natural integrity of the aquifer could be permanently compromised, rendering the original well's careful engineering irrelevant. William hesitated before sharing his final piece of information. "He's called an emergency session of the Water Commission for tonight instead of waiting for the regular meeting. Only commission members have been notified. It's not being advertised to the public." The strategy was clear. Sterling intended to secure official approval for his operation before public awareness could generate opposition. The commission members, most of whom had business relationships with Sterling, would rubber stamp his request without broader community input. William's inside knowledge provided them a crucial advantage. Instead of waiting for the scheduled public meeting, They would need to appear at the emergency session, an unexpected intervention that would force Sterling to address their claims before his friendly audience of commission members. As darkness fell, Everett prepared for what might be their final opportunity to expose the truth. The original Henderson documents were carefully wrapped and hidden inside his jacket. Thomas had arranged for several respected ranchers to attend this supposedly closed meeting, creating witnesses Sterling couldn't easily dismiss or intimidate. Violet would remain with Lily at the cabin, both for the child's safety and to maintain their fallback position if the confrontation went poorly. They had copies of the essential documents secured in multiple locations, insurance against any attempt to destroy the originals during the meeting. The Territorial Water Commission met in the town hall, a modest building that served multiple civic functions in the small community. By design, the emergency session was sparsely attended. Sterling Maddox and 4 commission members, all significant property owners with ties to Sterling's enterprises. A clerk sat ready to record the proceedings, his pen poised over a fresh ledger page. Sterling stood at the front of the room, outlining his water development project with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his proposals approved without question. Behind him, maps displayed the Henderson property with Hollister's drilling sites marked in red ink, deliberately obscuring the property's original boundaries to reinforce Sterling's claim of ownership. The well represents a significant opportunity for territorial development, Sterling concluded, his voice carrying the practiced authority of longtime power. I'm requesting expedited approval to continue operations without delay, given the urgent water needs of the region. The commission chairman, a banker whose mortgage business depended heavily on Sterling's goodwill, nodded with transparent eagerness. Seeing no reason for delay, I believe we can proceed directly to a vote. The rear doors of the town hall swung open, interrupting the chairman mid-sentence. Everett entered first, followed by Thomas Whitman and 6 ranchers whose properties bordered Sterling's holdings. Their appearance transformed the private approval session into an impromptu public hearing, creating exactly the scenario Sterling had hoped to avoid. Sterling's face darkened with barely controlled fury as he recognized Everett. This is a closed commission meeting, Kane. Your presence is neither required nor welcome. Everett moved steadily to the center of the room, directly opposing Sterling before the commission table. The territorial water statute requires public notification of all commission meetings, closed or otherwise. Since that notification was apparently overlooked, these gentlemen, all property owners with water rights concerns, have accompanied me to ensure proper procedure is followed. It was a technical but effective challenge, forcing the commission into a procedural corner. Denying legitimate property owners the right to attend would violate the very regulations that gave the commission its authority. The chairman sputtered, caught between Sterling's obvious displeasure and the legal requirements of his position. This emergency session was called to address immediate water development needs. Thomas Whitman stepped forward, his advanced age and status as one of the territory's original settlers commanding automatic respect. And what could be more immediate than addressing the unlawful seizure of a legitimate water claim, one that was deliberately hidden from this commission and from the people of this territory? Sterling moved to intercept what he clearly recognized as a coordinated challenge to his authority. These wild accusations have no place in a technical discussion of water resource development. Mr. Kane has already fled jurisdiction once to avoid legal proceedings regarding his fraudulent property claims. Everett removed the Henderson documents from his jacket, placing them on the commission table where all could see the official seals and signatures. I've never left the territory, Mr. Maddox. That story was your creation, just like your claim to my property. The original deed lay exposed before the commission, its attached water rights documentation bearing the territorial seal from 1847, decades before Sterling had established his first claim in the region. Alongside it, Everett placed the correspondence between Henderson's grandfather and his own great-grandfather, detailing their agreement to protect the artesian well for future territorial development. These documents establish 3 critical facts, Everett continued, his voice steady despite the tension filling the room. First, that I am the legal owner of the Henderson property, having purchased it and all associated rights in a public auction. Second, that an artesian well of significant volume and quality exists on that property, having been documented by territorial surveyors in 1847. And third, that this water source was deliberately preserved for the benefit of the entire territory, not for exclusive control by any single individual. Sterling's composure cracked, the facade of civic benefactor slipping it to reveal the obsession beneath. That water belongs to me by right. My wife died because Henderson's family hoarded that resource during the drought of '79. They watched her suffer while sitting on a well that could have saved her. The emotional outburst silenced the room. For the first time, the personal vendetta driving Sterling's decades-long water acquisition became clear to everyone present. What had appeared to be merely business ambition was revealed as something far more complex. Grief twisted into obsession, a widower's pain calcified into unyielding control. Everett had not known this specific connection, but the revelation explained much about Sterling's relentless pursuit of the Henderson property. The man's first wife, William's mother, had been Henderson's sister, making Sterling believe the family had deliberately withheld water that could have saved her during the typhoid outbreak. Is that what this is about? Revenge against the Henderson family? Everett's question cut through the tension, addressing the human element beneath the legal dispute. Sterling's face contorted with decades of suppressed emotion. They knew the water was there. Jacob Henderson's father helped survey that land in '47, same as your grandfather. They found that artesian well, and then they sealed it away, claiming they were preserving it for the future. They let people suffer. Let my Mary die, while their precious future never came. The raw pain in Sterling's voice shifted the energy in the room, creating an uncomfortable awareness of the man behind the power. This wasn't just about water rights or property ownership. It was about a grieving husband who had channeled his loss into the only outlet that gave him a sense of control. William Maddox stepped through the doorway, his expression reflecting the complex emotions of a son hearing his mother's memory invoked in this public forum. He moved to stand not beside his father, but between the opposing parties, a physical representation of his divided loyalties. Father, I've seen the original documents. Mother died in August of '79. The Henderson property was under territorial quarantine from June through September that year. No one could access the well, even if they wanted to. The papers were in grandfather's records. The revelation struck Sterling like a physical blow. His son's careful research had uncovered the truth he had refused to see for 30 years, that the Hendersons had been legally prevented from sharing their water source during the critical months of the typhoid outbreak, not withholding it out of selfishness. William placed a territorial document on the commission table, the quarantine order that had sealed off the Henderson property during the disease outbreak, signed by the same officials who had certified Mary Maddox's death certificate. The connection Sterling had built his vendetta upon crumbled beneath this simple historical fact. The commission room fell silent as Sterling stared at the document, 30 years of certainty dissolving before his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its commanding edge, replaced by something hollow and uncertain. Everything I've built was to make sure no one else suffered as she did, to control the water so it couldn't be withheld again. Everett recognized the pivotal moment, a man facing the possibility that his life's driving purpose had been built on a misunderstanding. With remarkable restraint, he didn't press the advantage, but instead acknowledged the genuine pain that had motivated Sterling's actions. The original survey notes show something your engineers might have missed, Mr. Maddox. The artesian well wasn't sealed to withhold water. It was engineered to maintain optimal pressure and flow for generations. Henderson and my ancestors weren't hoarding a resource. They were protecting it until the territory developed the governance to manage it properly. Everett spread the technical drawings from his grandfather's journal, showing the careful engineering that had gone into the well's construction. Unlike modern drilling operations that often depleted aquifers within decades, the Henderson well had been designed for sustainable flow that could serve the entire region indefinitely if properly managed. The commission members leaned forward, their interest shifting from procedural approval to genuine engagement with the technical and historical evidence before them. The chairman, sensing the change in atmosphere, attempted to regain control of the proceedings. This emergency session will recess until these documents can be properly reviewed by territorial experts. In the meantime, all operations on the disputed property will... A commotion from outside interrupted the chairman's statement. The doors burst open again, this time revealing one of Sterling's ranch hands, his expression urgent as he pushed through the gathered ranchers. "Mr. Maddox, the drill site, there's been an accident." Hollister tried to continue boring and hit a pressure pocket. "Water's coming up through the ground faster than they can control it." The news electrified the room. Everyone present understood the implications. Hollister had proceeded with drilling despite the morning's warning signs, likely under pressure from Sterling to produce results before the commission meeting concluded. Now the aquifer's natural pressure, contained for generations by the Henderson family's careful engineering, had found release through the improperly sealed borehole. The emergency created an unexpected opportunity. As the commission members and Sterling hurried toward the Henderson property to assess the damage, Everett's evidence remained on the table, witnessed by the ranchers and town residents who had gathered during the confrontation. Thomas Whitman ensured copies were made of the key documents, distributed to those present to prevent any subsequent attempt to suppress the information. By the time they reached the barn, darkness had fallen completely, but lanterns illuminated a scene of chaotic activity. Water pulsed from the ground near Hollister's main drilling site, creating a widening pool that reflected the lantern light like molten silver. The mining engineer directed frantic efforts to seal the breach, but the pressure continued to increase, forcing workers to abandon equipment as the water level rose. Sterling stood at the edge of the forming pond, watching as the resource he had sought to control escaped into the open, becoming public knowledge through the very act of attempted seizure. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. His desperate rush to claim the well had resulted in its premature and uncontrolled revelation. William approached his father, speaking low enough that only Sterling and Everett, who stood nearby, could hear. "This is what Henderson and the Canes were preventing, Father. Uncontrolled release that wastes the pressure built up over centuries. Their engineering maintained the aquifer's integrity, exactly what your drilling has now compromised." Sterling's expression shifted from anger to something more complex, regret mingled with the dawning recognition that his obsession had potentially damaged the very resource he had sought to control. 30 years of single-minded pursuit had culminated in destruction rather than possession. As water continued to flow from the compromised drilling site, the gathered townspeople and ranchers witnessed firsthand the richness of the resource that had been hidden beneath the Henderson property. Already the mineral-laden water was creating distinctive patterns in the soil where it spread, visible evidence of its unique properties. The chairman of the Water Commission, belatedly recognizing the historical and practical significance of the discovery, attempted to reassert official authority over the situation. This development clearly requires territorial oversight. Until proper assessment can be conducted, all claims to this water source are suspended pending review. It was a bureaucratic response to a situation that had moved beyond paperwork and legal maneuvers. The artesian well had revealed itself to the entire community, transforming from hidden secret to public knowledge in a single evening. Whatever Sterling or the commission decided officially, the practical reality had fundamentally changed. Everyone now knew about the water source that could potentially transform the territory's agricultural prospects. As the night deepened and more residents arrived to witness the spectacle, Everett found himself standing beside William Maddox, watching as the water continued to flow from the earth in a steady stream rather than the geyser they had feared. The engineering failure had ironically resulted in a controlled release rather than a catastrophic blowout, preserving much of the aquifer's pressure. "My father built his entire identity around controlling water," William observed, his gaze fixed on Sterling's isolated figure at the edge of the growing pond. "I'm not sure he knows who he is without that purpose." Everett considered the complicated truth of Sterling's character, a grieving husband whose pain had calcified into ambition, a man who had pursued water rights with religious fervor born from personal tragedy. The revelation about the quarantine had shattered the foundation of his 30-year vendetta, leaving him adrift in the current of events he could no longer direct. "Sometimes a man gets so focused on fighting old battles that he can't see the war is already over," Everett replied, watching as the commission members clustered around the drilling equipment, assessing damage and assigning responsibility with the practiced efficiency of bureaucrats. Violet arrived with several other townspeople, having heard the commotion from her father's ranch. She brought news that improved their positions significantly. Billy Peterson had successfully delivered the documentation to the territorial surveyor in Green River, who had immediately dispatched an official inquiry to the local commission. The territorial government was now officially involved, limiting Sterling's ability to manipulate local officials. Most significant was the news about James McCall. The territorial marshal, upon receiving the surveyor's inquiry, had reviewed the charges against him and found them insufficient to justify continued detention. James had been released from jail that evening, his reputation damaged, but his freedom restored. As the gathering at the well site transformed from emergency response to impromptu community meeting, Everett recognized the fundamental shift occurring in the territory's power dynamics. Sterling's monopoly had been built on exclusive knowledge and control, both now compromised by the public revelation of the artesian well. The resource he had pursued for decades was now visible to everyone, impossible to hide or claim exclusively. Thomas Whittyman organized the ranchers present into an impromptu committee, beginning discussions about cooperative water management that would benefit the entire region rather than a single controlling interest. The practical expertise of men who had struggled with water scarcity for years now focused on the opportunity presented by the artesian discovery. Sterling watched these developments from a distance, his usual commanding presence diminished by the night's revelations. The territorial commission members, sensing the shift in power, began distancing themselves from their former patron, aligning instead with the emerging consensus for shared water management. By midnight, the immediate crisis had stabilized. Hollister's drilling equipment had been moved away from the compromised borehole, and the water flow had established a steady rhythm that suggested the aquifer's pressure was finding a sustainable release. The impromptu pond continued to grow, its mineral-rich waters already attracting notice for their clarity and purity. Everett made his way back to the hunter's cabin, where Lily waited anxiously for news. The night's events had transformed their circumstances dramatically, from hiding in fear of Sterling's retribution to standing at the center of a community awakening to new possibilities. The legal battle for ownership of the Henderson property remained unresolved, but the more significant victory had already been achieved. The well's existence was now public knowledge, beyond the reach of any individual's control. As dawn approached, Everett sat beside the cabin window, watching the first light illuminate the valley below where lanterns still surrounded the flowing well. Lily slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, the immediate danger to their safety removed by the public nature of the confrontation. The Henderson letter he had discovered weeks earlier took on new meaning in light of recent events. What flows beneath is worth more than gold, but only to those who share rather than hoard. The wisdom of generations past had proven itself. The well's value lay not in exclusive control, but in its capacity to transform an entire community when properly shared. The battle wasn't over, but its nature had fundamentally changed. Sterling's power had been built on secrecy and exclusive access. Both advantages were now gone, eroded by the steady flow of water from the earth he had sought to possess. Whatever legal maneuvers might follow, the truth had emerged into the light, as unstoppable as the artesian waters themselves. Morning light spilled across the valley, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. The crystalline tower of water that had erupted from the compromised drilling site now flowed in a controlled stream, creating a pool that gleamed like polished silver in the dawn. Townspeople gathered at the perimeter, their faces reflecting wonder and speculation as they witnessed firsthand the miracle hidden beneath their feet for generations. The Henderson barn, or what remained of it after Sterling's excavation, stood as a silent witness to the transformation unfolding around it. Everett made his way down the ridge path with Lily beside him, her small hand clasped firmly in his. For the first time in weeks, they walked openly rather than skulking through underbrush or traveling under cover of darkness. The territorial surveyor's official inquiry had established sufficient legal protection that Sterling could no longer threaten them with impunity. The danger hadn't passed entirely, but it had changed form, from personal vendetta to bureaucratic battle. "Look at all the people, Pa," Lily whispered, her eyes wide as they approached the gathering. "The entire town seems to be here." Indeed, it appeared the community had emptied itself to witness the phenomenon. Farmers and ranchers stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants and townspeople, their usual social divisions temporarily forgotten in the face of shared amazement. Children ran along the edge of the growing pool, testing the temperature of the water with cautious fingers, their excited voices carrying across the morning air. Thomas Whitman greeted them at the edge of the crowd, His weathered face creased with satisfaction despite the exhaustion evident in his posture. He'd remained at the site throughout the night, ensuring the emerging consensus about cooperative water management wasn't derailed by Sterling's allies on the commission. The territorial judge arrived an hour ago, Thomas informed them, nodding toward a cluster of official-looking men near the main drilling equipment. Seems your friend Billy Peterson delivered those documents with remarkable efficiency. Judge has already issued a temporary stay on all drilling operations pending full investigation. This development represented their first significant legal victory. The territorial court outranked the local water commission, and the judge's stay effectively prevented Sterling from resuming operations regardless of local permission. More importantly, it established official recognition of the dispute's legitimacy, moving it beyond the realm of personal conflict into formal territorial concern. The crowd parted as they approached the flowing well, conversations hushing momentarily as people recognized Everett, the man whose stubborn refusal to surrender his 50-cent purchase had ultimately revealed the hidden treasure. Some nodded respectfully, while others studied him with newfound curiosity. No longer the town's struggling widower, he had become central to a discovery that might transform the territory's future. Near the well itself, Edward Hollister, the mining engineer Sterling had imported from Denver, directed workers in constructing a temporary containment system. The man's professional pride had clearly suffered from the previous night's failure, but his technical expertise remained valuable in preventing further damage to the aquifer. His original drilling plan lay abandoned, replaced by efforts to work with rather than against the natural pressure system. Violet and James McCall approached from the direction of town, their expressions reflecting cautious optimism rather than the tension that had marked recent weeks. James still bore evidence of his time in jail, a healing cut above his eye and stiffness in his movements, but his upright posture conveyed restored dignity. His unlawful detention had become another point against Sterling in the court of public opinion, transforming personal suffering into community leverage. The territorial surveyor says the original well mechanism is still intact, Violet reported, her voice carrying quiet excitement. The accident didn't damage the main artesian channel, just released pressure through a secondary path. They believe the Henderson design can still be implemented once they secure the breach Hollister created. This news confirmed what Everett had hoped, that generations of careful engineering hadn't been destroyed by modern interference. The well's integrity meant that proper development could proceed as originally intended, balancing optimal flow with long-term sustainability. Judge Carlin has called for a public hearing this afternoon, James added, his tone reflecting satisfaction at this procedural victory. Every property owner with water concerns has the right to testify. Sterling can't control the narrative anymore. The community's awakening manifested in dozens of small conversations throughout the gathered crowd. Ranchers who had competed fiercely for limited water access now discussed cooperative irrigation channels. Farmers calculated potential crop yields if reliable water became available, regardless of rainfall patterns. Merchants anticipated economic growth that would follow agricultural stability. A territorial official approached, his formal attire marking him as distinct from the predominantly practical clothing of the local residents. Mr. Kane, Judge Carlton requests your presence at the preliminary assessment. As the deed holder of record, your testimony regarding the original well design is considered essential. The official recognition of Everett's legal standing represented another shift in the balance of power. No longer the defendant against Sterling's accusations, he had become a primary witness in an official investigation, his knowledge of surveying and water systems suddenly valuable rather than merely obsessive. Lily tugged at his sleeve, her expression serious beyond her years. Go on, Pa, I'll stay with Miss Violet. You need to tell them about Grandpa's journals so they understand how special the water is. Her permission granted, Everett followed the official toward the judge's makeshift headquarters, a canvas tent erected near the edge of the property where maps and documents now covered portable tables. Inside, territorial officials conferred with local representatives, creating an unprecedented collaboration between governance levels that had historically operated with minimal coordination. Judge Harlan Carlton cut an imposing figure despite his advanced age. His white beard and formal black coat projected authority, but the intelligence in his eyes suggested a man who relied more on reason than position. Unlike the local Judge Sterling had manipulated, Carlton had built his reputation on impartiality and technical expertise in water law, precisely why the territorial governor had dispatched him to handle this potentially precedent-setting case. Mr. Kane, the judge acknowledged, gesturing toward the maps spread across the table. Your grandfather's surveying journals have proven remarkably prescient. These aquifer projections from 30 years ago match our modern measurements with impressive accuracy. The validation of his grandfather's work warmed Everett even as he focused on the practical matters at hand. The technical discussion that followed centered on the artesian well's unique characteristics, its consistent pressure, mineral composition, and potential flow rate if properly managed. Everett's years studying his grandfather's journals allowed him to speak with authority that surprised even the professional hydrologist present. What makes this discovery particularly significant, Judge Carlton noted as the discussion concluded, is not merely its volume, but its sustainability. Properly managed, this aquifer could provide reliable water for generations without depletion. The Henderson Kane design anticipated conservation principles our regulations have only recently begun to address. The judge's assessment elevated the discovery beyond immediate property rights to questions of territorial resource management. This wasn't simply about who owned the land above the well, but about establishing precedent for how such resources would be governed going forward. As they exited the tent, Everett noticed Sterling Maddox observing the proceedings from a distance, his usual entourage of allies notably absent. The rancher's isolation reflected his diminished influence. Commission members who had previously deferred to his wishes now clustered around the judge, aligning themselves with the new center of authority. William stood nearby, not beside his father, but not entirely separated either, his position reflecting the complex loyalty of a son witnessing his father's downfall. The afternoon hearing transformed the town hall from administrative building to community forum. Every bench was filled, with additional residents standing along the walls and spilling out the doors. Judge Carlton presided from the commission's usual table, but the proceedings bore little resemblance to the rubber-stamp sessions Sterling had previously orchestrated. Property owners testified one after another, describing how Sterling's water monopoly had affected their livelihoods. Ranchers detailed extortionate rates that had forced them to sell parcels to Sterling's holdings. Farmers explained how selective water allocation had been used to punish those who opposed Maddox's interests in other contexts. Merchants recounted how their businesses suffered when Sterling directed his workers to boycott establishments that showed independence. The cumulative effect created a comprehensive picture of monopoly power extending far beyond water rights into every aspect of territorial life. What had appeared to many as isolated grievances emerged as systematic control, orchestrated over decades by a man whose personal tragedy had warped into territorial domination. When Sterling's turn to speak arrived, the hall fell silent, anticipation palpable as he approached the front. His usual commanding presence seemed diminished, not by physical reduction, but by the stripping away of deference that had previously surrounded him. For perhaps the first time in 30 years, he faced an audience that no longer feared his retribution. The artesian well on the Henderson property represents years of investment and research, Sterling began, his voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere. My water development projects have sustained this territory through multiple droughts. Without my foresight, half the farms represented here today would have failed decades ago. His argument emphasized the infrastructure that he had built, reservoirs, irrigation channels, and water storage systems that had indeed benefited the territory, though at prices that ensured his continual profit and influence. The facts weren't incorrect, but the framing ignored the coercive practices that had accompanied these developments. Judge Carlton allowed Sterling's testimony without interruption, his expression revealing neither agreement nor dismissal. When Sterling concluded, the judge posed a single penetrating question. Mr. Maddox, if your primary concern has been territorial development rather than personal control, why conceal the existence of an artesian well that could have benefited the entire region? The question struck at the heart of Sterling's contradiction, his claim of public service versus his demonstrated pattern of hoarding resources for leverage. His response revealed the twisted logic that had guided his actions for decades. The Henderson family concealed that well while people suffered. Their selfishness cost lives, including my first wife's. I vowed then that water would never again be controlled by those who didn't understand its true value. The irony of his position, condemning concealment while pursuing exclusive control, hung in the air between them. Judge Carlton's follow-up cut through Sterling's self-justification with surgical precision. And yet your response was not to reveal the well's existence for community benefit, but to attempt securing exclusive rights through property acquisition and legal manipulation. How does that differ from the concealment you condemn? Sterling had no effective answer. The contradiction between his stated motivations and actual methods had finally been exposed in a forum where his influence couldn't suppress the logical conclusion. Whatever genuine grief had initially driven him had long since transmuted into something indistinguishable from the very behavior he claimed to oppose. William Maddox requested to speak next, his decision to testify publicly marking a definitive break from his father's position. His testimony focused on technical rather than emotional aspects, the scientific principles behind sustainable aquifer management, the long-term benefits of cooperative water systems, and the engineering marvel the Henderson cane design represented. What my colleagues at the Agricultural College would find most remarkable about this discovery, William explained, his educated diction contrasting with the frontier speech patterns around him, is not just the water volume, but the conservation principles embedded in its design. This system was engineered to maintain pressure and purity indefinitely, not to extract maximum short-term yield. It represents exactly the approach modern water management advocates, prioritizing sustainability over immediate profit. His technical assessment transformed the narrative from property dispute to visionary conservation, reframing the Henderson cane decision to seal the well as foresighted stewardship rather than selfish concealment. Coming from Sterling's spawn, educated specifically in modern water management, this perspective carried particular weight with both officials and community members. Everett's testimony came last, focusing on the documentary evidence that established both his legal ownership and the historical context of the well's concealment. The original correspondence between Henderson's grandfather and his own great-grandfather painted a clear picture of men who understood the potential for conflict water scarcity would create, and who chose to protect rather than exploit a resource they viewed as community birthright rather than private property. My grandfather taught me that water isn't something any man truly owns, Everett concluded, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the packed hall. It's something we hold in trust for those who come after us. Henderson and Kane didn't hide that well out of selfishness. They preserved it until the territory developed the wisdom to manage it for everyone's benefit. The simplicity of this perspective resonated with the gathered community in ways legal arguments couldn't match. It appealed to the frontier values of stewardship and community survival that had guided the territory's earliest settlers, values often overshadowed by later emphasis on property rights and individual acquisition. Judge Carlton called a recess to consider the testimony before rendering preliminary findings. As the crowd dispersed into the late afternoon sunlight, Everett found himself approached by ranchers and farmers who had previously viewed him with indifference or mild contempt. The man who had spent 50 cents on an apparently worthless barn now received nods of respect and offers of assistance in developing the water resource his purchase had revealed. Lily waited outside with Violet, her face lighting up as he emerged from the hall. "Did you tell him about the special minerals in the water, Pa? Did you explain how Grandpa said they make things grow better?" Her innocent question captured what many adults had overlooked in their focus on water volume and property rights. The unique mineral composition that made the artesian well not just a water source, but a potential agricultural game changer. The Henderson letter had mentioned crops growing with twice the yield, a claim Everett had initially attributed to exaggeration, but which his grandfather's analysis suggested might be scientifically valid. When Judge Carlton reconvened the hearing an hour later, his preliminary findings reflected both legal precedent and practical reality. The original deed purchased by Everett at public auction was declared valid, along with all associated water rights dating back to the 1847 territorial grant. Sterling's claim, based on historical water development, was rejected as it applied to the specific Henderson property, though his existing rights to other water sources remained intact. Most significantly, the judge ordered the formation of a water cooperative to oversee development of the artesian well, with membership open to all property owners within the potential service area. This structure would prevent any single individual, including Everett himself, from exercising exclusive control over the resource, while ensuring equitable distribution based on acreage in need rather than financial leverage. These findings represent preliminary rather than final judgment, Judge Carlton cautioned, as murmurs of approval spread through the hall. A comprehensive territorial review will follow, including geological assessment and engineering recommendations. However, the evidence presented today clearly indicates the artesian well represents a public resource of extraordinary significance, warranting special governance structures beyond standard water rights allocation. The judge's innovation, creating a cooperative management structure where none had previously existed in territorial water law, acknowledged both the unique nature of the discovery and the community interest in preventing future monopolization. It was a solution that honored the original intent of Henderson and Kane while adapting to current territorial needs. Sterling received the judgment with rigid composure that masked whatever emotions churned beneath. His decades of accumulated influence hadn't been entirely stripped away. He remained the territory's largest landowner and controlled numerous water sources beyond the Henderson property. But his monopoly had been decisively broken, and the precedent established would limit his ability to leverage remaining resources for control rather than fair commerce. As the formal proceedings concluded, the community's focus shifted naturally from legal questions to practical implementation. The temporary containment system Hollister had constructed needed replacement with permanent infrastructure that would properly manage the artesian pressure. Irrigation channels would require surveying and construction to deliver water to surrounding properties. Administrative structures for the newly formed cooperative needed development from scratch. These practical challenges created unexpected opportunity for reconciliation. William approached his father as the crowd dispersed, speaking with deliberate formality that acknowledged their strained relationship while offering professional respect. Your reservoir system west of town would integrate perfectly with distribution channels from the artesian well. Nobody understands water storage engineering in this territory better than you do. The olive branch took the form of technical collaboration rather than emotional appeal. Recognition of Sterling's genuine expertise separate from his controlling methods. After 30 years pursuing water acquisition, Sterling possessed practical knowledge about territorial hydrology that could prove invaluable in developing the new resource properly. Sterling's response came slowly, pride visibly wrestling with pragmatism as he absorbed his son's suggestion. The Johnson Creek watershed would require reinforcement before additional flow could be accommodated. The seasonal flooding patterns would compromise any standard irrigation channel. This technical observation, accurate and immediately useful, represented Sterling's first contribution to cooperative rather than competitive water management. Whether motivated by desire for continued relevance or genuine concern for proper implementation, his willingness to share knowledge rather than hoard it marked a significant shift. William nodded toward the territorial engineers gathered near the judge's tent. They've been discussing exactly that concern for the past hour. Your watershed maps from the '89 survey would save them weeks of preliminary work. The invitation was clear. Sterling could either withdraw into bitter isolation or contribute his legitimate expertise to a development that would proceed with or without him. His choice would determine whether 30 years of water engineering knowledge benefited the community or disappeared into resentful silence. Lily watched this exchange from Everett's side, her perspective unclouded by adult complexities. Mr. Maddox looked sad, Pa, like my friend Annie when she had to share her special doll with her cousin. The child's simple observation captured an essential truth. Beneath Sterling's calculated exterior lay the fundamental human struggle between selfishness and community, between hoarding and sharing. His lifelong identity had been built around exclusive control. Transitioning to collaborative stewardship represented not just practical adjustment, but existential reinvention. As darkness fell, activity around the artesian well continued under lamplight. The territorial engineers had established 24-hour monitoring to ensure the temporary containment system remained stable until permanent infrastructure could be constructed. Already, preliminary work had begun on clearing channels that would direct the overflow toward natural watersheds rather than allowing it to pool aimlessly. Thomas Whitman joined Everett, and Lily as they prepared to return to their cabin for the night, his expression thoughtful as he observed the bustling activity. Strange how something hidden can change everything once it's brought to light. Been thinking about what your grandfather told me years ago about this well, that it wasn't just the water itself that mattered, but what it would reveal about us when finally discovered. The philosophical observation aligned with Everett's growing sense that the artesian well represented more than merely hydrological significance. Its discovery had forced the community to confront fundamental questions about resource management, power distribution, and the balance between individual rights and collective welfare. Questions that extended far beyond water allocation into the territory's evolving identity. The following days brought a flurry of activity as the territorial government's involvement transformed what might have remained local dispute into regional development project. Surveyors mapped potential irrigation channels radiating outward from the artesian well. Engineers designed a permanent control system that would regulate flow while maintaining the natural pressure that made the source so valuable. Administrators established frameworks for the cooperative Judge Carlton had mandated. Everett found himself in the unexpected position of authority, not through official appointment, but practical necessity. His understanding of both the technical aspects of the well and the historical context of its concealment made him essential to proper implementation. The surveying skills he'd learned from his grandfather, previously viewed as impractical heritage, now placed him at the center of territorial development. Lily thrived amid this transformation, her natural curiosity making her a favorite among the territorial engineers who explained their work in simplified terms that nonetheless respected her intelligence. She absorbed technical concepts with remarkable speed, her questions often cutting to practical concerns adults had overlooked in their focus on theoretical models. "What happens when it rains really hard?" she asked during a planning session for the main distribution channel. "Wouldn't all the extra water make the channel overflow if it's already full from the well?" The simple question prompted engineers to incorporate seasonal overflow systems they had initially deemed unnecessary given the artesian well's consistent pressure. Lily's childhood experience with puddles and streams provided practical perspective their technical training sometimes missed, a reminder that environmental knowledge came in many forms. A week after the well's dramatic revelation, the first official meeting of the newly formed Prosperity Junction Water Cooperative convened in the town hall. Property owners from throughout the potential service area attended, representing diversity of operations from large cattle ranches to small vegetable farms, established businesses to newly arrived settlers. The common denominator wasn't wealth or influence, but stake in sustainable water management, precisely the inclusive structure Henderson and Kane had envisioned generations earlier. William Maddox presented the proposed management structure, combining his Eastern education with practical knowledge of territorial conditions. The system balanced proportional allocation based on acreage, with minimum guarantees ensuring even the smallest operations receive sufficient water for basic needs. Pricing followed similar principles, scaled according to usage, but capped to prevent exclusion through financial means. "This isn't charity," William emphasized as he addressed concerns about subsidized rates for smaller properties. "It's practical community development. Every productive farm or ranch contributes to territorial prosperity, regardless of size. Ensuring universal access to water creates wealth that benefits even the largest operations through increased commerce, stable workforce, and expanded markets." His economic argument transformed what might have been perceived as idealistic resource sharing into practical business development, appealing to self-interest as well as community welfare. By framing universal water access as investment rather than charity, he created coalition between large property owners who might otherwise have resisted proportional pricing and smaller operators who required protected access. Sterling attended this meeting but remained uncharacteristically silent throughout the proceedings, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts as the cooperative structure took shape without his direction. His physical presence represented tacit acknowledgement of the new reality, even if he wasn't yet ready to actively participate in its development. The cooperative's first official action established immediate relief for properties suffering under the current drought, emergency water delivery to ranches and farms at risk of failure before permanent infrastructure could be completed. This practical response to immediate need demonstrated commitment to community welfare beyond theoretical planning, building confidence in the new organization's purpose and effectiveness. As the meeting concluded, James and McCall approached Everett with news that shifted their perspective on recent events. The marshal received word from Wyoming yesterday. Seems there really was someone claiming to be you, trying to sell territorial water rights he didn't own. Sterling's men weren't entirely fabricating that story. They just had the wrong cane. This unexpected development added complexity to their understanding of Sterling's actions. The rancher's information network had apparently detected legitimate fraud, but his obsession with the Henderson property led him to automatically connect it to Everett rather than investigating more thoroughly. The territorial marshal was now pursuing the actual confidence man, whose scheme might have succeeded had Sterling not inadvertently complicated the situation. The irony prompted Thomas Whitman's dry observation. Seems even Sterling's mistakes eventually served the greater good, though certainly not how he intended. 2 weeks after the Artesian Well's dramatic unveiling, the temporary containment system was replaced with permanent infrastructure based on the original Henderson cane design, but enhanced with modern engineering improvements. The control mechanism regulated flow while maintaining optimal pressure, ensuring sustainable output that could serve the territory indefinitely rather than depleting quickly through unrestricted extraction. The first irrigation channel reached completion shortly thereafter, carrying mineral-rich water to a demonstration field where crops had been planted specifically to test the Henderson letter's claims about enhanced growth. The results exceeded even optimistic projections. Vegetables emerged from the soil with remarkable vigor, their color more vibrant and growth more robust than identical plantings using standard water sources. Territorial agricultural experts arrived to analyze the phenomenon, confirming through scientific testing what Henderson and Kane had documented through observation generations earlier. The artesian water contained mineral concentrations ideally suited to the region's soil composition, addressing specific deficiencies that had limited agricultural productivity throughout the territory's development. The mineral composition isn't just beneficial, it's transformative, the lead agricultural scientist explained as officials toured the demonstration field. These growth rates suggest potential yield increases of 60 to 70% across most standard crops, with particularly dramatic improvements in drought-sensitive varieties that previously couldn't be cultivated reliably in this climate. This scientific validation elevated the discovery's significance beyond water quantity to water quality, suggesting potential agricultural transformation that could reshape the territory's economic future. Properties previously considered marginally viable for farming could become productive with access to the mineral-rich irrigation, diversifying the predominantly cattle-based economy. 6 months after purchasing the Henderson barn for 50 cents, Everett stood on the hillside overlooking what had become the center of territorial development. The original barn was gone, replaced by the permanent wellhead structure that regulated the artesian flow. Irrigation channels extended outward like spokes from a wheel, carrying water to properties that had previously existed at the mercy of rainfall patterns and Sterling's price setting. The most visible transformation, however, wasn't the infrastructure, but the landscape itself. Fields that had been dust brown now showed vibrant green, crops flourishing under consistent irrigation enriched with minerals uniquely suited to their growth. Orchards planted along the primary channels already showed promising development, their eventual fruit production representing agricultural diversity previously impossible in the semi-arid climate. Lily stood beside him, her perspective having expanded along with the community's. The past months had accelerated her education beyond academic subjects into practical knowledge of hydrology, agriculture, and community organization. She absorbed these lessons with the adaptability of childhood, integrating new concepts with innate wisdom that sometimes surpassed adult understanding. The water was always there, wasn't it, Pa? Just waiting for the right time to come out. Her observation contained philosophical depth beyond her years. Recognition that natural resources existed independent of human discovery, neither created nor destroyed by our awareness, but simply revealed when circumstances aligning with need and capability. The right time and the right people to handle it properly, Everett agreed, acknowledging both the resource's inherent value and the human stewardship required for its optimal utilization. Henderson and Grandpa understood something that took the rest of us generations to learn, that some treasures belong to everyone or no one at all. Property owners throughout the region had gradually recognized the advantages of coordinated development, stable pricing, technical support, and infrastructure maintenance beyond what individual operations could sustain independently. What began as enforced cooperation through legal mandate had evolved into voluntary collaboration as practical benefits became evident. William had emerged as the cooperative's natural leader, bridging the gap between his father's generation of individual resource control and the emerging model of collaborative management. His education provided technical credibility, while his family connection to both sides of the original conflict positioned him as mediator between competing interests that still occasionally surfaced in administrative decisions. Most significantly, the artesian wells development had broken Sterling's stranglehold on territorial water rights without destroying the legitimate infrastructure he had built over decades. Reservoirs, storage systems, and irrigation channels developed under his direction were gradually integrated into the broader cooperative network, creating distributed resilience against drought that benefited everyone while acknowledging his genuine contributions to regional development. 2 years after the momentous discovery, the territorial governor arrived for official recognition of what had become known as the Prosperity Junction Model, a water management approach that balanced private property rights with public resource stewardship in ways that challenged conventional frontier development patterns. What had begun as personal conflict between Everett and Sterling had evolved into precedent-setting innovation in territorial resource governance. The official ceremony took place beside the artesian well, where the governor unveiled a bronze plaque commemorating both the original Henderson-Kane partnership and the contemporary cooperative that had fulfilled their vision. The inscription acknowledged the foresight of men who had preserved a precious resource until the community developed governance structures capable of managing it sustainably. Recognition that transcended individual property rights to honor intergenerational stewardship. Standing among the gathered officials and community members, Everett reflected on how thoroughly his life had transformed from the desperate man who had spent his last 50 cents on an apparently worthless barn. The cabin where he and Lily had once struggled to maintain basic subsistence had been replaced by a proper house overlooking the wellhead, built partially from the salvaged lumber of the Henderson barn, as symbolic connection between past preservation and future development. Violet McCall, reinstated as teacher with enhanced responsibilities for agricultural education, stood nearby with her father James, whose ranch had flourished under reliable irrigation. Thomas Whitman, officially retired but still actively involved in cooperative governance, represented continuity between the territory's early settlement and its current evolution. These allies who had risked Sterling's retribution now held respected positions in the community's expanded vision. Sterling himself attended the ceremony, his position in the community transformed but not erased. While his monopolistic control had been broken, his decades of water engineering expertise had proven valuable in addressing the technical challenges of integrating the artesian well into existing water systems. His gradual transition from opposition to grudging contribution reflected a man finding new purpose in shared enterprise after a lifetime of control. The governor's speech emphasized the broader implications of what had begun as local water dispute. The Prosperity Junction Cooperative demonstrates what's possible when we balance individual initiative with community welfare, principles that will guide territorial development as we approach potential statehood. The water flowing from this well nourishes not just crops, but a vision of governance appropriate to our unique Western conditions. This framing elevated their local innovation to territorial significance, suggesting potential influence on governance structures that would shape the region's future for generations. What Henderson and Kane had preserved through physical engineering, their descendants had developed through social engineering, systems designed for sustainability rather than immediate exploitation. As official ceremonies concluded and community celebration began, Everett found himself approached by the territorial postmaster, who delivered a letter bearing postmarks from multiple locations indicating lengthy transit. The envelope, addressed simply to current owner Henderson property, contained a single sheet of paper in unfamiliar handwriting. To whoever found our family's legacy, news of the artesian well's discovery has reached us even in our distant home. My husband would have been gratified to know his family's preservation efforts have finally fulfilled their intended purpose. The careful stewardship your community has demonstrated confirms that the right time and the right people have indeed arrived. What you may not yet realize is that the artesian well represents only part of what our family mapped during their early surveys. The same mineral deposits that enrich the water extend throughout the surrounding region, creating potential for development far beyond current operations. My husband's grandfather identified patterns suggesting multiple aquifer systems connected beneath properties currently considered marginal or worthless. I've enclosed his original survey notes, which may assist your territorial experts in locating these additional resources. Like the well itself, this knowledge belongs not to any individual, but to the community prepared to manage it wisely. With gratitude for honoring our family's vision, Martha Henderson enclosed with the letter were yellowed pages of survey notes dating from the territory's earliest settlement, showing geological formations and potential water sources throughout the region. Information that would prove invaluable as development expanded beyond the initial artesian well. Martha Henderson had ensured her family's legacy extended beyond the property they had been forced to abandon, contributing to territorial prosperity they would never personally witness. The unexpected communication reinforced what Everett had come to understand through their journey. That true legacy transcended individual ownership to encompass contribution to community welfare across generations. Henderson and Kane hadn't merely discovered a valuable resource, they had established stewardship principles that outlived them, shaping development patterns decades after their personal involvement ended. As sunset painted the transformed landscape in amber hues, Everett and Lily stood on the hill overlooking what had become known as Henderson Basin, the flourishing agricultural center created by the artesian flow. The 12-year-old, who had once huddled in a drafty cabin, now confidently identified irrigation patterns and crop varieties, her natural intelligence enhanced by practical education unavailable in any schoolroom. "When I grow up, I want to be an engineer like Mr. William," she announced, her gaze following the carefully designed channels that distributed life-giving water across formerly parched landscape. "I want to build things that help people for generations, even after I'm gone." Her ambition reflected values absorbed through experience rather than instruction, appreciation for creating lasting benefit beyond immediate personal gain. In this, she had internalized the essential wisdom of Henderson and Kane more thoroughly than many adults who focus primarily on technical aspects of the water system rather than its philosophical underpinnings. The territorial governor approached as they contemplated the landscape, his formal attire somewhat at odds with the practical surroundings, but his appreciation clearly genuine as he surveyed the flourishing fields below. "Your grandfather and Henderson could never have imagined how their vision would transform an entire territory, Mr. Kane. From one well to a new model of resource management that may well influence Western development for the next century." Everett considered this assessment, measuring it against what he had learned from his grandfather's journals and the Henderson correspondence. Their vision was always bigger than one water source. They understood something fundamental about the frontier, that our greatest resources mean nothing without the wisdom to manage them properly. The governor nodded thoughtfully, his gaze encompassing the community that had evolved from isolated homesteads competing for scarce resources into interconnected operations supporting mutual prosperity. The West wasn't conquered by lone individuals, despite what Eastern newspapers might romanticize. It was built by communities who learned to balance independence with cooperation, especially regarding water. This perspective challenged conventional narratives about frontier development that emphasized rugged individualism above all other values. The reality, as demonstrated by Prosperity Junction's evolution, incorporated both individual initiative and community structures, private property and shared resources, competition and cooperation in pragmatic balance, dictated by environmental conditions rather than abstract ideology. As twilight deepened into dusk, lamps illuminated the wellhead structure, where engineers maintained round-the-clock monitoring of the system that had transformed regional prospects. Children played near the main reservoir, their carefree activity testament to security that consistent water access provided in a landscape historically defined by scarcity and uncertainty. Watching this scene of ordinary prosperity born from extraordinary discovery, Everett reflected on how thoroughly their community had fulfilled the vision Henderson and Kane established generations earlier. They had preserved the artesian well not for personal advantage, but for community benefit, trusting future generations to develop governance structures capable of managing it sustainably. That trust had eventually been rewarded, though not without conflict that tested both individual character and community resilience. Sterling's attempt to monopolize the resource had ironically catalyzed exactly the coalition necessary to implement proper stewardship, bringing together diverse interests that might otherwise have remained fragmented into the coherent governance structure the resource required. The well continues to flow at exactly the rate Henderson projected, Everett observed, noting the steady stream emerging from the control mechanism, not diminishing after 2 years of continuous use. The governor studied the engineering with newfound appreciation for its historical context. Remarkable foresight, designing a system for generations rather than immediate extraction. A different understanding of value than we typically apply to natural resources. This perspective represented the most profound transformation stemming from the artesian discovery, not the physical infrastructure or agricultural productivity, but the conceptual shift from treating water as commodity to recognizing it as intergenerational trust. This principle had gradually expanded beyond water management to influence broader governance discussions throughout the territory, challenging conventional frontier development patterns that prioritized immediate exploitation over sustainable stewardship. As darkness settled completely over Prosperity Junction, the community Henderson and Kane had envisioned generations earlier continued its daily activities beneath stars that had witnessed the territory's entire human history. The artesian well flowing steadily at its center represented not just hydrological miracle, but philosophical legacy. Reminder that the most valuable resources are those we preserve rather than exploit, share rather than hoard, and protect for generations beyond our own immediate benefit. From 50 cents spent on an apparently worthless barn had emerged not just personal prosperity, but community transformation, fulfillment of vision that required multiple generations to implement fully. The treasure Everett had discovered proved valuable precisely because he understood its true nature not as private property, but as shared birthright. Its worth measured not in personal profit, but in collective flourishing that would continue long after individual names faded from memory. Word count, 7,000.